this is something I learned from Peter Thiel, actually. He used to insist at PayPal that every single person could only do exactly one thing. And we all rebelled. Every single person in the company rebelled with this idea because it's so unnatural. It's so different than every other company where people want to do multiple things. And especially as you get more senior, you definitely want to do multiple things. And you feel it's like insulting to be asked to do just one thing. And Peter would enforce this pretty strictly. He'd basically say, I will not talk to you about anything else except this one thing I've assigned to you. I don't want to hear about how great you're doing over here. Like, just shut up. And Peter would run away. And then focus until you conquer this one problem. In school is you submit a paper to a TA, a draft to your friend, and the first thing an editor does is they take out a red pen, or nowadays, online, and they start striking things, basically eliminating things. The most important task of an editor is to simplify, 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 and that usually means omitting things. So that's your job too, is to clarify and simplify for everybody on your team. The more you simplify, the better people will perform. People cannot understand and keep track of a complicated set of initiatives. So you've got to distill it down to 1, 2, or 3 things and use a framework that they can repeat. They can repeat without thinking about. They can repeat to their friends. They can repeat at night. Don't accept the excuse of complexity. A lot of people will tell you that, well, this is too challenging. This is too complicated. Well, yeah, I know other people simplify, but that's not for me. This is a complicated business. They're wrong. You can change the world in 140 characters. You can build the most important companies in history in a very simple to describe concept. You can market products in less than about 50 characters. There's no reason why you can't build your company the same way. So force yourself to simplify every initiative, every product, every marketing, everything you do, and basically take out that red and start eliminating stuff. Second thing is what editors do is they ask you clarifying questions. So when you present a paper to somebody, what do they usually do? They find some ambiguity somewhere and they say, well, did you really mean this? Do you mean that? Do you have an example of this? That's what your job is. So you're in a meeting and people are going to look to you. And the real thing you do is you actually ask a lot of questions. And they can be simple, basic questions like, should we try this 7 days a week or 6 days? They can be fundamental questions like, where's our competitive advantage here? We try to do this actually as investors too. Some investors will ask you a billion questions about a billion things and they'll have you do diligence forever. We try to narrow down to what are the 1, 2, or 3, 4 things that actually matter for this company and only focus on those things. So it allows us to be more decisive and we can make decisions rapidly. It allows us not to distract you from your day job, which is actually building a company. And yet I think we still get to the highest fidelity answer because we don't have all these extra extraneous pieces of details and data. Now it's hard, it's something you have to practice, but when you're good at it, every step you eliminate, Andy Grove estimated that you can improve performance by 30 to 50%. The next thing you do is allocate resources. So in the editing construct, this is what editors do all the time. They take editors from the Mideast and covering the Mideast, and they move them to Silicon Valley because Silicon Valley is now more interesting. Or they move them to a sports section because they want to compete on the basis of sports with other journals and other publications. So that can be top down, where I take a bunch of resources and people and say, we're now going over here, we're going to compete on this basis. And then next month, next quarter, next year, I'm like, well, that Middle East coverage is getting boring and bland. We don't want to do that anymore. Let's go chase after something else. Or it can be bottom up. Just like journalists mostly come up with their own stories, the people who work with you generally should be coming up with their own initiatives. So a reporter will generally, who covers Google, come up with the interesting stories that they're hearing in the ether and propose 1 or 2 to their editor for approval. But it's not like the editor saying, go cover Google and this is the angle I want. Once in a while they do that, but that's not the meat and potatoes of what a journalist does every day. Your goal over time is to actually use less red ink every day. So one way of measuring how well you're doing and communicating to your colleagues about what's important and what's not, why some things are important, some things are not, is how much red ink you're pulling out every day. And it's okay if you have a bad day and the red ink's all over the place, but it's not okay if the red ink next month is more than it was last month and next quarter is more than this. So measure yourself of how much red ink you're creating. The other thing that's very important that actually isn't as intuitive to a lot of people is the job of an editor is to ensure a consistent voice. So if any of you read The Economist, you can tell that there's one consistent voice. You can pick up any article, any post in The Economist, and it feels like it was written by the same person. Ideally, your company should feel like on your website, on your PR release, on your packaging if it's a physical product, anywhere on your recruiting pages should feel like it was written by one person. That's extremely difficult to do. And at first, you're going to be tempted to do that yourself, which is okay for a founder to do that, him or herself initially. Over time, you do not want to be doing all of the consistent voice editing by yourself. You want to train people so they can recognize the differences in voice. So if you see this website page, it looks very different than the recruiting page, you start asking questions, why is that? Is the reporting messed up? Is one of the leaders over here not really understanding the voice of the company? So you have to fix that over time, but you want to start with the objective of everything should feel exactly the same. It's quite difficult in practice. Almost every company has at least one piece of the organization that isn't exactly on the same voice. At Apple, which is even under Steve's regime, which was notorious for getting this right, if you ask someone who worked at Apple, ask them about the internal tools about recruiting. Do they really feel like Apple products? All of them will tell you no. So you're never 100%, but you definitely want to get as close to that as you can. The next complicated topic is delegating. So just like the other thing I like about the metaphor of editing is writers do most of the work in the world. Editors are not actually writing most of the content in any publication. So that's actually true of your company. You are not going to do most of the work. You shouldn't be doing most of the work. And the way you get out of doing most of the work is you actually delegate. Now the problem with delegating is that actually you're responsible for everything. So as CEO, founder, there is no excuse. There's no like, that's that department over there, this person over there screwed up. You're always responsible for every single thing, especially when things go wrong. So how do you both delegate but not abdicate? It's a pretty tricky challenge, and both are sins. Like if you over-delegate and you abdicate, or you micromanage, those are both sins. So I'm going to give you a couple techniques for solving this. First, and this actually comes from high output management and Andy Grove, is what's known as task-relevant maturity. It's kind of a fancy phrase for basically, has this person ever done this before? It's really simple. Like, how mature is this person in doing something? And the more they've done the exact same task before, the more sort of rope you're going to give them. And the more they're trying something new, the more you're going to actually instruct them and consistently, constantly, regularly monitor. So that's kind of a basic concept, but it's worth keeping in the back of your brain. The interesting implication, and this is pretty radical, is that any executive, any CEO should not have one management style. Your management style actually needs to be dictated by your employee. So with one particular person, you may be very much a micromanager because they're quite low on this scale. And with another person, you may be delegating a lot because they're actually quite mature on this scale. So it's actually a good thing if you do reference checks on somebody and half the people you call say they're a micromanager and the other half say they actually give me a lot of responsibility. That's actually that's a feature, not a bug. I didn't understand that at first at all. Like I used to be befuddled when people would do reference checks on me and come back with this like complicated mosaic. And I basically finally figured out that maybe I was actually doing my job correctly. And so then, of course, taught other people that this is the way to do it. A more nuanced answer, though, that I've sort of came up with is how do you make decisions and delegating versus doing it yourself. You don't want to do it yourself too often. So what I've basically borrowed from Peter, this is my first 2x2 matrix ever in my life, but he taught me something at least, is you basically sort your own level of conviction about a decision on a grid. You know, extremely high, extremely low. There's times when you know something's a mistake, and there's times where you wouldn't do it that way, but you have no real idea whether it's the right or wrong answer. And then there's a consequence dimension. There are things that if you make the wrong decision are actually catastrophic to your company and you will fail. There are things that are pretty low impact that really at the end of the day aren't going to make a big difference, at least initially. So what I basically believe is that where there's low consequences and you have very low confidence in your own opinion, you should absolutely delegate. And delegate completely. Let people make mistakes and learn. On the other side, obviously where the consequences are extremely dramatic and you have extremely high conviction that you're right, you actually can't let your junior colleague make a mistake. You're ultimately responsible for that mistake, and if it's really important, you just can't allow that to happen. Now, the best way to do that is to actually explain your thinking, the why. It's easy to shortcut when you get busy explaining whys of the world, but it's very important to try. When I was at LinkedIn, I had a colleague who's quite talented, but occasionally would get annoyed if I didn't exactly agree with his opinion on something. And so I'd spent a lot of time trying to persuade him why I was making a decision a certain way. And his wild card, the card he would ultimately call out if I didn't quite persuade him, was he's like, okay, you're the boss. And that meant to me like I was burning a lot of social capital. Every time he said that, I knew I was like really creating a thin line, and that ultimately that was going to backfire if I did that too often. So you want to track the times that you're doing that. An example of this at Square is one of my favorite people in the world, and my second hire, first marketing hire, had this program he wanted to run called Inner Square, which basically allowed people to give out Square merchants to give out 10 other squares to their imagine a food truck outside, put like 10 squares on the counter, and people could just grab them. And Kyle had this great idea, this would be an awesome marketing program. Squares would spread squares to other people. And you know, to some extent, it was on brand, so it didn't have catastrophic consequences. Each of these 10 squares didn't cost that much money, so financially we could afford to do it. But at that time, my 10 years of experience said there's just no way this is going to work at a meaningful enough scale to move our metrics enough, and I actually would prefer we not do this. But Kyle was so excited about this that I decided to just let him do it. He learned that actually when you measure this thing, it's not massive. It doesn't create like massive value for the company. It did require a fair amount of operational complexity to ship all these squares to people and figure out how to get them squares, etc. But it allowed him to be excited about his job and to learn how to filter future ideas. So it was totally worth letting him make the quote-unquote mistake. The next and possibly most important thing you do is actually edit the team. So these are the people that you work with. And nobody's going to have a perfect team, and you're certainly not going to start that way. So what I'm going to try to do is maximize the probability for success in editing the team. So I like this idea of barrels and ammunition. So most companies, once they get into hiring mode, as Sam pointed out, you should defer that for a while, but once you do, they just hire a lot of people. And they're like, you expect that as you add people, your throughput, your horsepower, your velocity of shipping things is going to increase. It turns out it doesn't work that way. Usually when you hire more engineers, you actually don't get that much more done. You actually sometimes get less done. You hire more designers, you definitely don't get more done. You get less done per day. We can talk about why. So the reason why is that most people, most great people even, are actually ammunition. But what you need in your company are barrels, and you can only shoot through the number of unique barrels you have. So that's how the velocity of your company improves, is by adding barrels, and then you stock them with ammunition, and then you can do a lot. So if you go from a 1-barrel company, which is mostly how you start, to a 2-barrel company, suddenly you get twice as many things done per day, per week, per quarter. If you go to 3 barrels, great. If you go to 4 barrels, awesome. Barrels are incredibly difficult to find, but when you have them, like give them lots of equity, promote them, take them to dinner every week, because they're virtually irreplaceable, because they're also very culturally specific. So a barrel at one company may not be a barrel at another company, because one of the ways, the definition of a barrel is they can take an idea from conception all the way through shipping and bring people with them. And that's a very culturally specific opportunity, specific skill set rather. So 2 questions probably are occurring to you is how do you figure out who's a barrel and who's not? One is you start actually with a very small set of responsibilities. It can be fairly trivial. It can be something like, I want to reward the engineers that are in my office at 9 o'clock at night, every night, with a nice cold, fresh smoothie. This is actually a real example. I was frustrated. Our engineers were working really hard at Square, and maybe 20% to 30% would stay very late into the evening. And I wanted to we already had served them dinner, but I wanted to give them something cool to reward them. And you could think about alcohol, but that's a little complicated. So smoothies were probably a little bit better than the pizza, which drains you of energy. But nobody could get smoothies in my office to show up at 9 o'clock sharp, that were cold, that tasted good, and delivered in the right place so that engineers would find them. You'd think this is simple, but in fact, it took months to get this right. So then we had an intern start, and I think on his second day, I was explaining this problem, and he said, well, I'll do it. And I was like looking at him like, there's no way. I've seen my office manager fail, my assistant fail, all who are actually pretty good. This just isn't going to happen. And then lo and behold, that night they show up on time, cold, delivered the right place. And my first instinct was, great, nothing about the smoothies, but okay, now I can actually give them something more important and consequential and complicated to do. And that's what you actually want to do with every single employee every single day, is expand the scope of their responsibilities until it breaks. And it will break. Everybody, I couldn't run the world. Everybody has some level of complexity that they can handle. And what you want to do is keep expanding it until you see where it breaks, and that's the role that they should stay in, that level of sophistication. But some people will surprise you. There will be people who you don't expect. Without with different backgrounds, without a lot of experience, that just can handle enormously complicated tasks. And so keep testing that and pushing the envelope. The other signal to look for is once you've hired someone is with an open office, just watch who goes up to other people's desks, particularly people that they don't report to. If people start going to your desk, individual employee's desk, and they don't report to them, it's a sign that they believe that that person can help them. So if you see that consistently, those are your barrels. Just promote them, give them more opportunity as fast as you can. The other question everybody asks about people is, when do you hire somebody above somebody, and when do you sort of mentor somebody, or when do you need to replace somebody? And the way to think about this is every company has its own growth rate, and every individual has their own growth rate. So some companies that are very successful, let's say LinkedIn was always a very linear company. It never went like this. So for example, I joined LinkedIn 18 months after we launched, and we had only 1.5 million users, which in a social product is a very small number. And when I joined, I was the 27th employee. When I left 2.5 years later, we only had 57 employees. In contrast, when I joined Square as the 20th employee, 2.5 years later, we had like 250, 300 employees. So each company has its own velocity on this curve. And if the company's going like this, you can only keep people in the roles that their own personal learning curve is going like this. On the other hand, if the company's growing like this, anybody whose learning curve is faster than that, you can keep giving them the same role to do. So always track like the individual slope of an employee and the company's growth rate. Now that you have your barrels identified, so you're going to pick out the people that can really take an idea that you have in the back of your head, scope it out, run with it, make it happen, ship it, and it's perfect. Where do you aim these barrels? So I'm going to argue that you really need to spend a lot of time focusing people. This is something I learned from Peter Thiel, actually. He used to insist at PayPal that every single person could only do exactly one thing. And we all rebelled. Every single person in the company rebelled with this idea because it's so unnatural. It's so different than every other company where people want to do multiple things. And especially as you get more senior, you definitely want to do multiple things. And you feel it's like insulting to be asked to do just one thing. And Peter would enforce this pretty strictly. He'd basically say, I will not talk to you about anything else except this one thing I've assigned to you. I don't want to hear about how great you're doing over here. Like, just shut up. And Peter would run away. And then focus until you conquer this one problem. And the insight behind this is that most people will solve problems that they understand how to solve. Roughly speaking, they will solve B+ problems instead of A+ problems. A+ problems are high impact problems for your company, but they're difficult. You don't wake up in the morning with a solution, so you tend to procrastinate them. So imagine you wake up in the morning and you create a list of things to do today. There's usually the A+1 on the top of the list, but you never get around to it. And so you solve the second and third. And over an entire company of hundreds of people, that just cascades. So you have a company that's always solving B+ things, which does mean you grow and does mean you add value, but you never really create that breakthrough idea because no one is spending 100% of their time banging their head against a wall every day until they solve it. So I highly recommend some version of that. You can be less stringent. You can be like, you can get 3 things to work on. But I would still track at least the concept of what would happen if you only gave everybody one thing to prioritize.